The winter wind moves differently through old timber. It presses into the grain of the wood, as if searching for something left behind. On certain nights, when the air along the River Thames turns brittle with frost, the wind passes through broken shutters and empty halls and carries with it a memory older than the walls themselves. It remembers a season when England seemed to hold its breath, waiting for the sea to deliver something terrible. At first, the news traveled slowly, carried by tired horses and frightened men who spoke in low voices beside hearth fires. Monks copied letters by candlelight, describing ships that moved like dark birds across the eastern waters. Villages along the coast had already seen them, long shapes cutting through gray surf, shields along their sides like scales. People began to understand that these were not traders or wanderers. They were something far heavier. Years later, survivors would still struggle to explain the feeling that settled across the land. It was not simply fear. England had known raids before. Small bands had come and gone like storms that passed quickly. But this felt different. The rumors spoke of armies, not raiders, entire hosts of warriors who did not vanish after a single battle, but stayed, camped, and waited. Somewhere far from the coast, a shepherd once described the moment the silence changed. He had been watching his flock when a traveler stopped at the edge of the field and asked for water. The man's cloak was stiff with dried salt. His horse trembled from exhaustion. Before he drank, he whispered a single word that had begun to echo through monasteries and markets alike. Vikings. The word carried strange weight. Many who heard it had never seen a Scandinavian warrior. Yet stories had already grown around them like shadows around a fire. Men who feared neither winter nor death. Warriors who followed leaders that seemed carved from iron. Whether the stories were true mattered less than the way they spread through villages and abbeys like cold mist. In the halls of Wessex, messengers arrived with mud frozen to their boots. Maps were pulled from chests, though they offered little comfort. The coastline was long, the rivers countless. Every estuary became a door, every harbor a possible landing place. The kings and ealdormen who studied those maps began to understand something unsettling. The sea had become a road. Across the water, the men in those ships were not thinking about England as a kingdom. To them, it was a land of opportunity, rich fields and silver churches scattered across a divided island. Their leaders spoke of conquest not as a dream, but as a long, patient task. They had come before in smaller numbers. This time, they had come prepared to stay. The year was turning toward 871 when the tension finally hardened into something heavier. The Great Heathen Army, as later chroniclers would call it, had already burned its path through kingdoms that once believed themselves secure. Northumbria had fallen, East Anglia had been broken, Mercia staggered under the weight of war. Now the storm was leaning south. Those who lived through that winter would later remember how ordinary the days still seemed. Oxen still pulled plows through frozen fields. Monks still sang their prayers before dawn. Markets still opened beneath gray skies. Yet beneath every ordinary sound ran another feeling, quiet but persistent, like distant thunder traveling slowly over land. And somewhere along the cold edges of England, ships were already moving again, their sails dark against the winter sky, carrying warriors toward a kingdom that did not yet understand how close the storm had come.
There was a road outside Reading that winter where the frost never seemed to melt. Cartwheels pressed deep tracks into the frozen earth, and the hedges along the lane trembled each morning with the quiet movement of men passing through. Travelers who used that road later remembered the strange stillness of the countryside, as if the fields themselves had begun listening for something approaching from the east. Word had spread that the army from across the sea had chosen Reading as its resting place. The town stood where river and road met, a practical crossing point that any patient commander would recognize. Earthworks soon rose around it. Timber palisades appeared where gardens had been. Smoke from hundreds of unfamiliar fires curled into the pale sky. Those who watched from nearby villages could not see the whole army, only pieces of it. Groups of warriors moving through orchards, lines of shields resting against wagons, horses stamping beside crude tents stitched from sailcloth. Yet even these fragments were enough to disturb the imagination. The army felt less like a gathering of men and more like a weather system settling into place. Among them moved leaders whose names would later fill chronicles, but in that moment they were simply figures seen from a distance, silhouettes walking along the earthworks, studying the river crossings and nearby hills. Their patience unsettled the English who observed them. Raiders usually struck quickly. These men were preparing something slower. Inside Wessex, the weight of decision fell upon a young king whose reign had barely begun. Alfred the Great was not yet the figure history would later celebrate. He was a man still learning the shape of power, forced to carry the responsibility of a kingdom already under pressure. The news from Reading reached him like cold wind slipping through armor. Messengers spoke of the enemy's discipline. The army did not scatter to plunder every village in sight. Instead, it tightened its grip on the roads and rivers around the town, controlling the movement of food and travelers. It was a strategy that felt unfamiliar to many in Wessex. This was not chaos, it was planning. Farmers living near the river noticed the change first. Paths that once carried merchants now carried scouts. Small groups of Saxon riders appeared and vanished along the horizon, watching the growing fortress at Reading from a careful distance. The land between the two forces slowly filled with silence. One elderly monk, writing years afterward, described how the air itself seemed heavier during those weeks. People spoke less loudly in taverns. Priests lingered longer in prayer. Even the animals seemed restless. Horses shied at unfamiliar smells drifting across the fields from the Viking campfires. In quiet moments, when the wind dropped and the rivers slowed beneath thin ice, the countryside almost looked peaceful again. Smoke rose gently from distant farms. Ravens circled above empty fields. Yet every road pointed toward Reading now, and every traveler understood that something decisive was beginning to gather there. Before long, the stillness around the town would break, not suddenly and not with the dramatic clarity later stories prefer, but with the slow grinding movement of two forces beginning to test one another across frozen ground. Morning often arrived quietly, along the Thames Valley that winter, though the quiet never lasted long. Frost covered the low grass like a thin skin of glass, and the rivers moved slowly between their banks, dark and steady beneath pale skies. For a few moments each dawn, the countryside around Reading looked almost untouched by war, as if the land itself had forgotten the army waiting beyond its hedges. But the men who watched the horizon knew better. Riders from Wessex had begun appearing more frequently along the ridges and narrow roads leading toward the town. They rarely approached too closely. Instead, they studied the new earthworks from afar, noting the shape of the defenses and the movement of the warriors within them. Every glance carried questions that no one yet knew how to answer. The Viking camp had grown into something more permanent than anyone expected. Trenches curved around the settlement like dark scars across the frozen ground. Timber barricades strengthened weak points along the riverbank. Smoke from cooking fires hung low over the valley, drifting slowly across fields where Saxon farmers had once worked without fear. Occasionally, the two worlds touched. A wandering herdsman might glimpse armored figures moving through a nearby orchard. A Saxon scout might hear laughter from the enemy camp, carried faintly on the wind. These brief encounters rarely turned violent, yet they sharpened the tension spreading through the countryside like a tightening rope. Inside Wessex, preparations were unfolding with equal urgency. King Alfred gathered men from villages and towns that had long lived under the protection of their local lords. Farmers, craftsmen, and young sons who had never held shields before now found themselves marching beneath winter skies toward a battlefield they could not yet see.
The army that formed around Alfred carried the quiet weight of necessity. These were not professional warriors alone. Many were ordinary men answering a call that could not be ignored. They brought with them memories of fields, families, and churches left behind, each man wondering whether those places would still be standing when spring arrived. Scouts returned with troubling reports. The Vikings at Reading were not waiting passively. Small groups had begun moving beyond their defenses, probing the surrounding roads and river crossings. They seemed interested not only in defending their camp, but in understanding the land itself, as though studying the kingdom they had come to challenge. One afternoon, a band of Saxon riders ventured too close to the earthworks and discovered how quickly patience could turn into violence. Warriors poured from the gates of the Viking camp with sudden precision. What followed was brief and brutal, leaving the frozen ground marked with signs that would remain visible for days. News of the clash traveled quickly through Alfred's gathering forces. It carried with it the unmistakable realization that the enemy would not simply sit behind their walls. They were ready to meet Wessex in open conflict whenever the moment arrived. As winter deepened and the days shortened further, both armies continued to move carefully across the same narrow stretch of land. The distance between them was shrinking now, though neither side seemed yet eager to strike first. In the quiet spaces between those movements, the valley waited, holding its breath beneath a sky that had begun to darken earlier each evening. The ground near Reading began to show the marks of conflict long before the largest fighting arrived. Hoofprints hardened into the frozen soil. Broken branches hung from hedgerows where riders had pushed through too quickly. In certain places, the grass had been trampled flat, forming strange circular patterns where men had once stood facing one another in tense silence. One narrow track running toward the river became particularly restless. Travelers who passed along it noticed how often distant movement flickered near the hills. Scouts from Wessex and watchers from the Viking camp drifted through the same fields like shadows, each side trying to measure the other without committing to open battle. Eventually, the distance closed. A small Saxon force moved toward Reading with the intention of testing the enemy defenses. They advanced cautiously, shields carried high, spears angled forward against the winter light. For a moment, the valley seemed to fall completely silent, as if even the birds understood that something fragile had just begun. The Vikings responded quickly. Warriors poured from the fortified town in disciplined groups, their shields forming tight lines as they moved across the frosted ground. What followed was not the dramatic clash later storytellers would prefer, but a tense, grinding struggle where neither side fully understood the strength of the other. Men slipped on the frozen earth while trying to hold formation. Commands were shouted and lost in the wind. Spears struck shields with hollow sounds that echoed across the fields. The battle shifted back and forth in confusing bursts of motion, sometimes advancing toward the town walls, sometimes pulling away toward the open countryside. At one moment, it seemed the Saxons might break through the Viking lines. Their push carried them close enough to glimpse the wooden earthworks that surrounded Reading. Yet the defenders held their ground with stubborn patience, slowly bending the pressure until the attackers began to falter. The fighting grew more chaotic as reinforcements from both sides arrived in scattered waves. Groups of warriors collided unexpectedly among hedges and shallow ditches. Dust from churned soil mixed with frost in the air, turning the battlefield into a haze where shapes appeared and vanished without warning. For the men caught inside that confusion, the battle felt less like a grand struggle for kingdoms and more like a series of desperate moments. A shield raised just in time, a stumble that nearly ended a life, the brief recognition in a stranger's eyes before one of them fell. As daylight weakened, the Saxon force gradually withdrew from the field, carrying wounded companions and leaving behind the quiet evidence of a fight that had not gone as hoped. The Vikings returned slowly to their defenses, their campfires beginning to glow again behind the timber walls. When darkness settled over the valley, the frozen ground held the memory of everything that had happened there. Both armies remained close, separated by little more than distance and exhaustion, knowing that the struggle for Wessex had only begun to reveal its true shape. The nights after the fighting carried a different kind of silence. Not the calm silence of winter fields, but the heavier quiet that follows exhaustion. Fires burned low across the Saxon encampments, their glow faint against the frost-covered ground. Men sat close to the warmth, repairing shields, drying damp cloaks, and staring into the flames as if trying to understand what the day had truly meant. Those who had returned from the clash near Reading spoke carefully about what they had seen. The Viking army had not broken apart under pressure. Instead, it bent and reformed like something accustomed to long struggle. That realization unsettled many who had believed the enemy would scatter once confronted with the full force of Wessex. Among the younger warriors, there was a restless energy that refused to settle. Some sharpened their blades long into the night, the sound of stone against iron repeating steadily through the camp. Others walked along the outer edges of the gathering, peering into darkness as though expecting movement beyond the fields. Within the Viking fortifications at Reading, the mood carried a different tone. Their campfires burned more brightly behind the timber walls, and voices rose in brief bursts of laughter that drifted faintly across the frozen valley. For them, the clash had confirmed something important. The kingdom to the south was willing to fight, but it was not yet strong enough to drive them away. The leaders within that camp continued their careful planning. They studied the rivers and roads that threaded through Wessex like veins through living land. The goal was no longer a simple raid. They were shaping a campaign that could stretch across seasons, forcing the Saxon kingdoms to exhaust themselves while the Viking army held its ground.
In Alfred's camp, the atmosphere remained quieter, though no less determined. Messengers arrived through the night, bringing news from other corners of the kingdom. Some villages were sending more men. Others could offer only supplies and horses. Every contribution carried the same message: Wessex could not afford to retreat now. The young king moved often among his soldiers during those nights. He spoke with men gathered around fires and listened more than he talked. Many would later remember those quiet conversations better than the battle itself. Alfred did not promise easy victories. Instead, he spoke of endurance, of surviving the storm long enough for the land to steady again. For the ordinary soldiers, those words mattered more than grand speeches. They had seen enough of the enemy to understand that this war would not be decided in a single moment. It would unfold slowly through cold mornings and uncertain marches across fields already scarred by fighting. Somewhere beyond the camps, farmers still watched their distant homes from hidden paths along the hills. Smoke rising from village chimneys offered small reassurance that life had not completely disappeared from the valley. Yet even those ordinary signs felt fragile now, easily erased if the war pressed much further into the countryside. As winter nights stretched longer and colder, both armies remained in uneasy proximity around Reading. Neither side seemed ready to abandon the struggle, and neither appeared capable of ending it quickly. The land between them waited quietly beneath the frost, holding the uneasy feeling that the hardest days of the war had not yet arrived. Long after the armies moved away from Reading, the valley remained strangely attentive to the memory of that winter. Travelers passing through in later years often remarked that the land seemed quieter there than in other parts of Wessex. The fields returned to cultivation, hedges were repaired, and new cottages appeared along the riverbanks. Yet the ground still carried stories that had never been fully spoken aloud. For the men who survived the fighting of 871, memory did not arrive all at once. It returned slowly, usually in quiet places far from battle. A farmer guiding his plow might suddenly remember the sound of shields striking together in the cold air. A former soldier might pause beside a river and recall the moment when winter sunlight flashed across an enemy blade. The campaign that had begun around Reading did not end there. The war continued through a series of hard encounters across Wessex, each one wearing down the strength of both sides.
Kingdoms that had once seemed distant from the conflict gradually found themselves pulled into its widening gravity. Through those difficult months, Alfred remained a figure many watched with cautious curiosity. Alfred the Great had entered the year as an uncertain young ruler facing a powerful invading army. Yet as the fighting unfolded, something quieter began to emerge beneath the surface of events. He endured. The Vikings, for their part, continued pressing against the defenses of Wessex with relentless patience. Their commanders understood that time itself could become a weapon. If the Saxon kingdom fractured under the pressure, the road south would open without the need for a final crushing battle. To ordinary people, the war was experienced differently from those who recorded it. To them, the conflict was not a sequence of named battles, but a long season of disruption. Fields went unplanted, roads became dangerous, families moved from village to village searching for safer ground, while rumors traveled faster than certainty. In moments like these, history rarely announces its turning points. It moves quietly through decisions made in cold camps, through endurance that seems almost ordinary at the time. What later generations describe as pivotal years often felt, to those living within them, like nothing more than survival from one uncertain day to the next. Sometimes the weight of that endurance becomes clearer only when the noise has faded. If this story has lingered in your thoughts the way those winter memories lingered for the people of Wessex, it is worth pausing for a moment before moving on, simply acknowledging how easily the past disappears when no one stops to listen. By the end of that difficult year, the Viking invasion had not destroyed Wessex, though it had come close enough to leave a lasting scar across the kingdom. The struggle would continue for years beyond 871, shaping the future of England in ways that few living then could fully imagine. Even now, when the wind passes through the valley near Reading on cold evenings, it carries the faint echo of that winter. Not the noise of battle itself, but the quieter memory of a kingdom standing uncertainly at the edge of its darkest hour, waiting to discover whether endurance alone could hold the storm at bay.